Grant Newsham, I'm telling you, when I saw your book, the cover and the title, I said, that's a man I got to talk to. When China Attacks, a Warning to America. Very provocative title, but I think that we would agree this is a very, very important subject and the threat is real. You are a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, and you're really focused on Japan, China, and that entire region there. Tell me briefly how you went from being in the military, in the Marines, and how you got to where you are today.
I'm probably sort of an example of what comes of a liberal arts degree, but also having a short attention span. But the way the sequence works is I joined the Marines in the early 80s, and it was peacetime, so it's boring. So like a lot of people, you go into the reserves after the initial 4 or 5 years. And so I've had several simultaneous careers. So while I was in the Marines and the reserves, I went to work for the State Department. For the Foreign Service. And I spent 7 or 8 years there doing a lot of work around the world, some in Asia, but a lot in South Asia, Afghanistan, that area, Pakistan. And then went to work for Motorola Japan. And my last assignment in the State Department was at the embassy in Tokyo. And I decided I'd had enough, so I went to work for Motorola. If you're old enough, you remember that company.
Oh, of course.
But I was there when it went into China and committed suicide. And then after that, I went to work for Morgan Stanley in Japan once again for over a decade. And then once that was done, I joined the commentary, I suppose.
The commentary.
So I'm one of these blowhards that I used to make fun of. But while you're doing all of these civilian jobs, you're also with the Marines. So you would come on and off active duty repeatedly. And one of the last things I did was I was assigned, had these vague orders because I was in Tokyo, and it says you're on active duty and you report to this somewhere. And it was a Japanese base. And I was the first Marine put into the position of an advisor to the Japanese military. And it was done quietly, partly because the Japanese thought it was so sensitive. And what we did is there was another Marine officer who was in on it, as well as some Japanese co-conspirators. And we thought the Japanese needed an amphibious because we had watched them let 2,500, 3,000 people freeze to death the first 24, 48 hours of the tsunami and earthquake in March 2011 because they didn't have an amphibious capability. So we thought they needed one. Plus, if you're going to, you could see the trouble coming from China. It already started, and the Japanese military was unable to fight like they need to do. So we gave them this capability. We did what was necessary, and that worked out pretty well. I've been in Asia for a long time, some decades actually, and lived in Japan 20 plus years. Still there all the time. Been in Taiwan, lived there as well, and researched some ideas on defending Taiwan, and have done work with the Taiwan Marines. So I've seen the region and also China as well from a number of different perspectives, not just the military, but also the financial, the diplomatic, the commercial as well. And it gives you a different sense of things. And I suppose my first involvement in China came in probably the late 70s. So it's been a while now. And I would say there's nothing that's happened in terms of China that has surprised me. But last thing I would note that for all these years I was in the military, coming on and off active duty. A couple jobs I had. One was I was the attaché in Tokyo 2 times, and you get a good look at things there. But also was the G2, Reserve G2, and the G5 at Marine Forces Pacific. And G2 means head of intelligence. The G5 means head of plans and really policy, sort of the foreign affairs, the Marines in the Pacific. So China has always been there, although I will note that until 2017, when the first Trump administration took place, you could not even say that China was an adversary. You couldn't even use those words, or you were in trouble. And it was that bad. now it's gotten better, but think about it, 2017, it should have been obvious by the early 2000s. And anyone who said otherwise was cashiered, fired, humiliated, and that's how it was.
Are you serious? I literally had on, just my jotting down of questions and all this. When America finally woke up to the threat of China, and you're saying to me, I didn't have to ask you a question. You're telling me that, is it the military or the White House? Who is behind, or who has been behind the idea that we have to either be hush-hush about the fact that China is a great threat to the world, I would say, but particularly the United States? Where did that mindset come from, or those orders come from?
It's been a bipartisan achievement, and we in equal measures by our sort of political class, the economic class, and the military went along as well. The top dogs did, at least. There were people down in the ranks who knew exactly what the problem was. But as you can see it, you saw it really in the early 2000s and late 90s, when there was this idea of putting China letting them into the World Trade Organization.
You know what I wanted to do before we go there? I just wanted us to take a walk from the 40s to today. And I know there's several sections in that timeline. And, maybe it's time to do a little history lesson for the American people and remind us where China was in the 1940s, World War II, of course, and post-World War II, the UN. And in particular, I want to hear that history with the end goal of the question, if America did not take the course that it did, would China be the economic and military threat that it is today? I suspect I know your answer. I think we financed China's success. So let's go back to the 40s, to the greatest generation.
Well, what you had, of course, in the 40s was World War II. And in World War II, the Japanese invaded China. And we were, of course, fighting the Japanese. And the Chinese government, called the KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, it actually did resist the Japanese very well. And they suffered mightily, but they did fight well. The Chinese communists who were there and were on the back foot, they lay low. They didn't do much at all to fight the Japanese. Their idea was let Chiang Kai-shek bear the brunt of it, and then when it's over, we'll be in a better position. But ultimately, so what happened? The war ended. There was a Chinese civil war as the communists and the better side, the least democratic to a larger enough of a degree, the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek's people, they fought it out. The KMT, a lot of it had to do with corruption on the part of the KMT and a very effective subversion campaign that the communists ran against the opposition. And they basically collapsed and fled to Taiwan. And at the time, the Americans, backed the KMT, but there was within the U.S. government, of course, there were people who were saying the communists are just agrarian reformers. They're the good guys. Let's actually, push the KMT aside and set up with the communists. Eventually, that sort of worked its way out of the system, and we did back Taiwan into the late 70s, and we did have almost nothing to do with the communist Chinese. And then we know about President Nixon going to China.
I want to go back to the United Nations because I think a lot of young people especially do not know that Taiwan used to be China, and it was on the Security Council of the United Nations. And then we essentially Taiwan, or was it called the Republic of China then? What was, okay. Or the KMT, but...
Yeah, we refer to the KMT. The KMT, that's the party that ran the Republic of China. And Republic of China refers to what we would call Taiwan today. So you had Communist China and the PRC on the mainland. And then the Republic of China, with the KMT as the party that ruled on Taiwan. So you've pretty much got two Chinas there.
And so for some reason, the Republic of China, now Taiwan, was on the Security Council. And I've never really done much reading, and we don't have to go into it, as to why those specific nations were chosen for the Security Council. But they were there. And then what was the transition, the date when Communist China replaced Taiwan?
It was in 1979, as I recall.
With Nixon.
78, 79. Yes. Well, it was actually Nixon is the fellow. Nixon went to China, communist China, in 1972.
Yeah.
And he had meetings with Mao Zedong, basically the murderer who ran the PRC. Had meetings with him. The idea was to make nice, and somehow we would become friends. And then it took some years, about 6 or 7 years, before the American government, and at the time it was Jimmy Carter. They sort of thought they had the cover to sort of do the necessary, do the dirty deed, and remove Taiwan from its position at the United Nations, which it had since since the UN's founding, because Republic of China was a major player in defeating Japan. So it had this spot on the Security Council. And the Carter administration, but behind everyone's back, they forced Taiwan out of the Security Council, let the Communist Chinese have Taiwan's seat. And that's what we have today.
I've never understood how they did that legally or according to the United Nations, charter. And I hadn't quite put two plus two together and realized that because Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China, which was Taiwan, because they had to escape to Taiwan and set up their government there, and they considered themselves to be China, the rightful rulers of China, but they were sort of in exile in a sense, because they played a very significant role in the defeat of Japan, or probably it was also very helpful to the United States, even though, of course, we brought that war with Japan to a very abrupt end with the bombing them with nuclear weapons. But I don't think the war would have gone as well as it did if we did not have the Republic of China fighting on our side.
Oh, that's correct. The Japanese had huge numbers of troops in China trying to defeat the KMT, trying to defeat Chiang Kai-shek's forces, while the Chinese communists were lying low and actually cutting deals with the Japanese in their territory. But it was the Chinese who really suffered. You've heard of the Jimmy Doolittle raid, which at least we all knew it, that those planes, the American bombers, had to crash land in China. And they landed in KMT territory, Chiang Kai-shek territory. And the Chinese went to great lengths to protect them, to get them to safety. And the Japanese, they paid them back. It's estimated as many as 250,000 Chinese were killed by Japanese forces in reprisals, retaliation for getting the Doolittle pilots and aircrew to safety. So the Chinese suffered, and there was a real understanding that China deserved a position on the Security Council. And once the Chiang Kai-shek had fled to Taiwan, the Americans did what was needed to ensure that Taiwan stayed on the Security Council, that it represented China. And then by the late 70s, the Carter administration decided that, they weren't all that important.
So they worked a deal with the rest of the Security Council? Did they just vote them off? Because everyone has a veto, and I've never just been able to understand that. And I suppose I haven't done my research.
Well, that's why we could keep them on, because we had a veto, so that you couldn't change the makeup of the Security Council. But once the Americans said, we don't mind, at that point it became easy.
And China could not veto on that proposal. or they were
No,
not allowed to veto?
no, not at all.
Wow.
They were glad to have it. Well, when we
No,
say China,
I mean
the Republic
Taiwan,
of
the Republic of China.
Taiwan they basically got a knife in the back, and it was actually recognized that there was such fear that the administration would actually allow Taiwan to sort of be taken over at that point. That by just refusing to provide arms and military support to Taiwan, and just allow it to go, let the Chinese communists to attack it, take it, and to have it just go away. There was such fear of that in Congress that something called the Taiwan Relations Act was passed almost immediately to try to handcuff the Carter administration and any future administration so that they are effectively required to support Taiwan so that it can defend itself. But that's what's behind the Taiwan relation. It still exists, and if you read the language up, it gives the Americans all the authority they need to do what is necessary to defend Taiwan and to give Taiwan the resources so that it can protect itself. But that was the fear, that a future administration would sell out Taiwan once, it would sell out the Republic of China, Taiwan once again. That fear has not gone away.
Just my own personal note, I've just always considered it such a humiliating betrayal, a shameful betrayal of an ally. And I think that this does not do well for America's standing and moral authority in the world when we consistently undermine our best allies, no matter how small.
Well, that's the point, and it hasn't changed at all. There's been a few that have learned their lesson as well. South Vietnam, for example, just a few years after Taiwan was, just not so long before Taiwan was pulled off the Security Council. Well, remember what we did with South Vietnam. The Congress, Democratic controlled, said, well, we've had enough of this. No more weapons, no more arms for you, no more support. And in short order, it was taken over by the North Vietnamese communists. And we do have a tendency to do that. And it still applies today, because we have an implicit promise that we've made to defend Taiwan or protect Taiwan. And if we decide, well, we don't really want to do that, and we allow it to come under Chinese domination, well, what message does that send to every other country in Asia and worldwide? Well, the Americans are not trustworthy. And I think what you would find if Taiwan comes under Chinese communist domination now is you will find Asia turning red very quickly, because every country cuts the best deal it can with the PRC. And so it's not just a military question. There's this reputation at stake. This really is America actually the guarantor of freedom on earth. It is about that simple and also that important. In Taiwan, and for better or worse, that's where this is really coming to a head. And so we got our work cut out for us. And Taiwan also, it's the thing about it is what China could have been, because it is a consensual democracy. They have every freedom that we could imagine, free, just very active press. They have elections where power changes hands, and it's just freedom of speech, freedom of movement, you name it. You don't have to get government permission if you want to take a trip to the southern end of the country or to buy a train. You can do anything you want if you're in Taiwan. And it scares the daylights out of the Chinese communists. Because the Chinese communists, well, they always claim that Chinese people can only be governed with a boot on the neck. And even Jackie Chan has said the same thing, as if there's something unique about the Chinese species that they require to be mistreated. And you look across the strait, 90 miles to Taiwan, and here's this bustling, thriving, very successful economically island that's full of people of Chinese origin. And so it puts a lie to everything the Chinese Communist Party said. And one of the things they do say, of course, is, well, we're so big that we have to have, that we can't govern any other way. But that is a lie as well. If you look at India, that's big and they have a democracy. But Taiwan really is something that is an existential threat, not militarily to the Chinese communists, but in terms of the ideology. And it shows what China is capable of. And if you go to Taiwan, it's a very sort of lively, friendly place. Go to China, and it's just a grim place with people who look care. And you couldn't be a starker contrast. Now, which one should we be supporting? Well, if you ask my former colleagues on Wall Street and in the business community, they would tell you, well, we make so much money from China. Well, they think that actually the track record of country companies that go into China over an extended period is not very good at all. But the Chinese have successfully played on the greed and the vanity of America's elite classes, and they've done it very well. When I say the Chinese, I mean the communist Chinese, and they really pulled off just really an amazing accomplishment over 30, 40 years of getting your main enemy to actually fund your bill. So
when Chiang Kai-shek went over to Taiwan, the island, how many people were able to leave with him? And were there already a huge number of people there? What was the population like?
Well, there weren't it was a few million. There was some millions on Taiwan, but it wasn't heavily populated. And millions of people came over from the mainland. And this is important to remember because the history matters, is that the newcomers from the mainland came and dominated the place. And they did it by force, and they killed a lot of people in the process. And that is not forgotten. So there's a distinction on Taiwan between families who've been there before the KMT, before the mainlanders came, and people who came after. It is a distinction. There is friction and animosity, but ultimately, on Taiwan, almost nobody wants to be part of communist China. But that is one of the things to remember. And also the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek group, they actually ruled Taiwan really very harshly. Not as bad as the communists, but they were not light about it.
They weren't playing patty cake in Taiwan. I remember they were tough.
And it was effectively a dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually, the Chiang Kai-shek's son actually, he didn't say it loudly, but he knew this couldn't continue. And what it did is it transformed by the early 90s into a democracy. They started having election and all these freedom once again. And it turned into a very different country. It went from this harsh authoritarian, really dictatorship's not a bad way to put it, one-party state to really the democracy we have today. But it's only been about 30 years. But nonetheless, it shows what you can do when you get some decent, humane people who realize something better is necessary, and they go about doing it. And the Taiwanese have taken to it very well.
That's beautiful. And I think part of the reason that they're able to do it is a dictatorship is kind of a generic, authoritarian regime. But once you have committed to communist, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, whatever ideology, it is an all-encompassing worldview. And I don't think it's as easy to extricate yourself from that. But let's move on. So we've got Chiang Kai-shek. He's moved over to the island of Taiwan. There were already Chinese there. Other millions of Chinese came with him, and they were on the UN Security Council. Then Nixon went over to make friends with China, with communist China. Was there any official proclamation or change in economic trade or trade at all policy when Nixon and Kissinger were over there doing their thing?
Nothing that really mattered. What they would say is, well, we started the process. But China at that time was still in the midst of what was called the Cultural Revolution, which started in the mid-'60s. And what you think, you just imagine complete chaos where the really extreme communists who want to show they're even sort of more sincere than everyone else are murdering people. And millions of people died in the Cultural Revolution. The place was just chaos. People were starving. It was had no economy at all to speak of. So when Nixon
millions
went,
and millions, tens of millions of people died of starvation because of the great. Was it the Great Leap Forward?
That's right. That was
They're
before the
always
Cultural Revolution. That was before the Cultural Revolution. It was they were going to sort of really rejuvenate China's economy. That didn't work, and you did have tens of millions who died. And the body count differs, but it's at least 50 million dead during communist rule of China, and this is in peacetime and good weather. So that tells you what communist regime will do and can do. So when Nixon went, that was the China. And it took some time for this opening up to get the Chinese economy moving.
Okay. I don't know if you've read his diaries, Kissinger, you probably have read all that. Do you have any insight as to why this broken, backward, weak nation that Nixon and Kissinger, or I'm not sure who was the protagonist here, felt the need to go over there and wake the giant, poke the dragon, and what was the point?
I think the ancient Greeks could have probably told you it was ultimately hubris, or being too clever by half. The idea was that, well, if we can wean China towards us, or move them towards us, that will break them off from the Russians. And at the time, it was believed that the Soviet Union was the problem. So this was going to be this very clever diplomacy that was going to split that China-Russia alliance, such as it was or wasn't, and it really wasn't as strong as they thought it was. So we went as the supplicant to woo this country that couldn't even feed its own people. They needed us a lot more than we needed them. But this was these guys thinking about, I don't know what. They would call it grand strategy is what they would say. But it didn't give much concern to the American people, nor to the nature of the Chinese regime. And that started off a chain of events that has put us where we are today.
Because we had this grand strategy, and I remember this now that you brought it up, as a matter of fact, it's in my notes, we wanted to counter Russia, the Soviet Union, the USSR. And isn't this hubris, as you say, that do we look decades down the line? Is our American politicians just too, unable to see that the unintended consequence, the law of unintended consequence, is something that we should assume will rear its ugly head? Because while we're cultivating China to check somehow Russia, we just created we changed the world, the entire dynamic of history.
That's right. If we hadn't done this today, you would have China about as powerful as Uruguay, but not as nice a country.
Yeah.
And that's what it would be. But it's worth remembering that this continued. It wasn't just it was Nixon and then Carter, and Gerald Ford was in there a bit.
I forget about
then the Reagan. I wish we'd had him twice. But then the Reagan administration came in, and they continued pretty much what the Carter administration had done. Mr. Reagan he understood the communists and he wanted to defend Taiwan, but he had advisors who were sort of, once again, too clever by half. So one of the things the Reagan administration did was they transferred advanced military technology, advanced artillery shell manufacturing, advanced torpedo technology to the Chinese. The idea being that if we extend the open hand of friendship, that they will like us, that they will reciprocate. And we're at the same time, we're drawing them further away from the Russians. Well, this was a mistake. There's really no excuse for not understanding what Chinese intentions were and what they were going to do with that. And then after Reagan came Bush, and it just continued. But then you really got the economic component of it. And what my company, Motorola, we were actually invited in by the Bush administration actually wanted the American company like Motorola to go in sort of as the anchor tenant after the Tiananmen Square massacre to show it once again, to build up the Chinese economy, show them we were their friends, we didn't want to harm them. And the idea was that if we did this, that China became more profitable, successful economically, that it would by definition have to liberate and sort of become like a big Canada, or at least back when Canada was nice. But that was the thinking. And here we are. This is like a science experiment. And the hypothesis, you have your hypothesis. And after a fairly short period of time, you realize, well, maybe we should rethink the hypothesis. And we never did until the first Trump administration. So you can sort of see how this has played out. And, sort of in my adult lifetime, I've seen it all happen. And none of this the outcome was not surprising. In fact, one way to just get a sense of what the thinking was throughout this era, and after George H.W. Bush, it was the Carter administration, and there was a fellow named Joseph Nye, who was one of the assistant secretaries of defense for a period. He was an Ivy League professor, and he said at the time, and he said it many times afterwards, that our policy was that as follows. We knew that if we treated China like an enemy, it would become one. So we were not going to treat China like an enemy. And the idea was that China would become a friend. So everything we did was from this lens of we cannot provoke China, we have to help and accommodate China, we cannot challenge them. And this is sort of in putting in so many words, I hope it's not a sort of the requiem for the United States for having created this juggernaut that is, for the first time in my life, we face a position where we could be in a war and we could actually lose it.
When I think about this Pollyannish sort of idea of foreign policy, where, this is not the same thing as working with a human being. You could take somebody who was a gangbanger, who sold drugs, who murdered many people, and he could be the most utterly evil human being on the face of the earth, and you could woo him with the love of God, forgiveness, and bring him to repentance because he would understand the evil of his ways. And there are many, many, many people who have turned from evil because they realized they came to the knowledge of the truth and repented and went on to live great, great lives, moral and righteous lives. A state is not a human being that you're wooing with the love or tenderness of your son who's gone astray, or the prodigal son type of thing. I don't understand. Is it you say hubris, and I guess I don't even need to beat this bush any further, but the reality that I think many Americans who are just common sense people, hey, we work, we struggle, we build families, we make hard decisions, we don't have unlimited wealth, we can't live in a grandiose fantasy and have all kinds of machinations and plans, and we just have to live life in reality. I don't think most Americans would look at the communist Chinese. I consider it an empire, not just a state. I think of it as an empire, as something that you could woo with hearts and flowers and promises of candy and wedding vows. I mean,
yeah, well, you can't. And also in what you described, Elizabeth, when people say go from evil to good, that there's also some rules they have to follow in order to transform. And if they don't want to follow them, well, they're going to wallow in that misery where they are. And with the Chinese communist case, there was no requirement that they reform. We were going to accommodate. There's actually an old Jack Benny show, which you wouldn't remember.
Oh, I love Jack Benny.
There's one where he says, I think Milton Berle is the other guy, and Jack Benny says there's no such thing as a bad boy. And at some point, this bad boy shoots Jack Benny, and then that's what we seemed like with the Chinese is, well, they just don't know what they're doing. And
So we
in
look,
fact, I
it's
spoke.
even worse
Yeah,
because in their eyes, we look foolish and weak and fearful. And so
very, very much.
it stokes the fire of their grandiosity and their fuels their ideas or their plans for global dominance. Because if they could pull off what they have since 1979, get taking Taiwan or with the Republic of China off the UN Security Council and just tossing them aside, handing Panama over, I mean, the canal over to Panama. I mean, they just must have been thinking, my wildest dreams have come true, and these people are so pathetic. This nation. They always say democracy doesn't work because look at the United States.
Well, you will note there's a couple things. One, that there's a lot of Chinese who would like to live here. And just about every Chinese of the top leadership and any Chinese with any wealth or any success, they want to get their loot, to get their wealth out of China into a place like the United States. They have real estate here, businesses here. They have ideally a relative with a green. And that's like a futures market where the people most successful in that system don't have enough confidence in it.
Are those people communists?
There's enough of them who are. But obviously they want to get away from the Chinese Communist Party. If we were smart enough and were actually play this right, we could just discredit the entire regime in China, and it has no legitimacy. And it's not as if, all 1 point however many billion Chinese all love the Chinese Communist Party. You wouldn't want to say you didn't. But if it looks like they're on a roll, that you're going to find people who come here to escape it actually might want to ride that wave. Because we don't push back, we never have, against the Chinese communists until the first Trump administration. They only had about 2 years. But it's funny, it's an anecdote, which I think tells you a lot about how we'd looked at China for too long, is that around 2015, I spoke to a general over at U.S. Indo-PACOM in Hawaii. And I said, why? Well, this is the second one. So I'll give two examples. One of them said, I asked him, well, why are you appeasing China? Because this was the military doing everything they could to engage with and treat China like an ally. And he said, well, what are we supposed to do? Go to war with them? Well, the thinking was that it was either a choice between appeasement or thermonuclear war. Well, there's some options in between. And then the second anecdote is it was another general who was actually a little higher. And I asked him, we were talking about China. And I said, well, why aren't you all doing much? And he says, well, because we want to give them offering. And the idea was that the Chinese were these just dim-witted children who didn't know what they were doing. And if we just humored them, that they would actually then start seeing how you should behave. And I pointed out that, well, maybe they don't want the off-ramps. Maybe they like what they're doing. Maybe they see that it's working because we're backing down. And we're talking about the military here, which is supposed to be the tough guys, not at all at that time. And they were following the orders that were coming from the White House, as they do. And the White House was completely sort of bought and paid for by the PRC. Too much of Capitol Hill was as well. And the business class, which I've seen firsthand.
What year are you speaking of right now?
About 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And the business class, they have always been entirely in bed with the PRC. And you just want to close a deal, get your promotion, get out of China, and have that corner office. Money. And that's what it comes down to. When when President Biden had that meeting with Xi Jinping in San Francisco, a couple of years ago, that he had a dinner with the business elites, and they gave him 2 standing ovations. The master of ceremonies for that was actually a former colleague of mine at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. But for the right price, that I've found that Westerners and Americans they'll perform like a sea lion at sort of a water park. Thinks he's going to get a mackerel snack. It's just the nature of it, and of too many. I would say it is not, however, regular Americans who think that way. If they heard what our elite classes had done, they would be aghast, and they would be out for. And particularly, it's the so-called flyover Americans. Remember, the deplorable, they're the ones whose children serve in the military and too often end up having to pay for the mistake of the Ivy League elites, etc., who have put us into this position. And I think they're getting tired of that. So I think that is something which should never be forgotten. The regular Americans, you recall when the spy balloon flew over the U.S. a couple of years ago, regular Americans looked at this and said, what the hell is going on? And the Biden administration's reaction was nothing. There's nothing to see here. It's not a problem. And in fact, they suppressed the inquiry into what was in that spy balloon. Well, the innards would have been U.S. technology, and they would not have even admitted that the balloon was there unless a photographer in Billings, Montana, had not looked up and taken some pictures. That's what the administration was going to do. They were concerned that this would throw off our relationship with the Chinese communists, and that was a couple of years ago. So you can see that we've put ourselves into a bit of a fix.
Well, when you said to me that anybody in your position back in, I don't remember what year you were speaking of at the time, that in the military, if you had referred to China as an enemy, an adversary, that you would be, decommissioned, thrown out of the military? What would they actually do to you? Did you see examples of this?
Oh, yes. I'll just give one small one involving me. It was in 2013 it was an exercise that we had gotten the Japanese to come to Southern California to do an amphibious exercise. And this was the first time they had ever done anything like that. And Xi Jinping actually asked President Obama to stop it. Obama, to his credit, did not. But this went on. And I was interviewed by I think it was Associated Press. And the comment I made was, if history has shown us anything, it is that when the free nations get together to defend themselves, it has a stabilizing effect. And the U.S. Marine Corps has these public affairs officers and commissars, and these people went absolutely insane. They were just trying to savage me, and because you can't say that, China won't like it, blah, 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 blah,
China
blah.
won't like it.
But there was only so much they could do to me because I was a reserve. But that was actually, and I had something similar happen a couple of years later, where it was colonels from headquarters Marine Corps and on the Marine Forces Pacific staff who were just irate and making all sorts of threats against me because I had told the Japanese that were visiting Hawaii they need to prepare to defend themselves. And that was the Marine Corps we're talking about. And it would have been about 2015. But also, and even worse, and here's the classic case, is around that time, the same time, 2014-15, the head of intelligence at the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, that was Captain James Fennell, he said publicly that China is getting ready to fight a war. And he had permission to make these statements. And what I'm told is that the Obama White House was incensed. They demanded his head, and he was effectively cashiered and forced to retire and humiliated in the process. And he now lives in a small town in Switzerland, and he was right. And all of these people who did what they did to him, and I'd cite the commander at PACOM, Admiral Harry Harris, these people threw him under the bus. And not one of these people has ever said they're sorry. So compared to what happened to me, what happened to Captain Fennell was just a disgrace. But here we are. Now we're in a position where, as I said, if the Chinese chose their spots and their timing, they could defeat us. And back then, if we had actually prepared and gotten ready, they wouldn't have a chance. Now we'd better get ready or get used to the idea of 5,000-10,000 Americans dying in an afternoon and the war coming to our homeland. But it's because of guys like, you saw what happened to people like him, like Captain Fennell, and just even the Marine Corps, supposedly the tough guy, who were basically fawning over the Chinese communists, that we put ourselves in a position that we are in extremis, and we don't have much time left.
Well, the book is called When China Attacks. Because I think we should just go there in a few moments. I want to quickly finish this timeline. When we brought China into the WTO, that's just weird. And what year was that?
It was something, if it's easiest around then. If you think early 2000s, you're in the ballpark.
Yeah.
So it's been 20 plus years now.
Yeah.
And gave them most favored nation status. Yeah.
Right. Well, prior to that, I was reading congressional witness testimony when I cannot remember if it was Senate or House, and they were debating whether or not this annual reauthorization was it of most favored nation status, and it was supposed to be reviewed annually, and it maybe it's performative, but at least it shows that there was awareness, and that they were in a particular category where they're just not they're not Great Britain. In our relationship with Great Britain, they don't have to be approved annually. And so we had that process going, and then they voted to give it permanent. It's not called most favored nation, it was permanent something something. And there were warnings. There were all kinds of warnings from those who were testifying that this is terrible for us economically. And then on the other side, there were people just saying that, well, if we show them, like what nice guys we are and how sort of welcoming we are to them, that we're not against them, then they will start obeying the rules of trade according to accepted international standards, and we'll just do that wooing thing. And people are actually on the record making those statements that, to me, it would make me blush. I'd be so embarrassed to have something coming out of my mouth like that. So what was the first thing? What was the first trade agreement we had with China before WTO?
Well, that's a good question. I'd have to go do my homework, but it was getting them the most favored nation status, and that would have been sort of in the 80s. It just became much easier to do business with China, and we were encouraging companies to go over to China and set up.
Was Reagan doing that? Obviously 80s.
It started, but it was George H.W. Bush. There was a move, but it was actually after Reagan that the real economic sort of progress.
So George H.W., former CIA, loved China. I mean, it just seemed like he was enamored with China. And go ahead, tell me a little bit about
he was, and he was considered a China expert based on having lived in China for all of 15 months or so when he was the ambassador there. 15 months. But after Tiananmen Square, which is where the Chinese Communist Party massacred over 10,000 of its people who wanted nothing more, all they wanted was a more honest government. So they gunned them down. It's on the internet. George Bush wrote a note to Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese dictator. And if you read it, it gives the word sort of fawning a bad name. He's saying, this wasn't good, but we're friends, we're family, we're going to get through this, and let's just work it out. And Bush, I'm told, and because I knew some people who were there at a meeting with him in the White House, I remember at the time saying that he couldn't believe his friends, the Chinese, had done this. So he was the one who really was quite willing to sweep all of this murder up under the rug.
So he's just credulous. Like, this is a person who is incapable of setting aside its biases. You love the culture. Maybe you go over there. You're there 15 months. You meet people. Obviously, as an ambassador, there's a tendency to want to have good relations. That's what diplomacy is all about. But, okay, you like Chinese people. You like Chinese food. You like their architecture. Their history is fascinating. Whatever. It's a mysterious land. But to allow that, have you ever noticed that more often than not that the person or academic who studies something becomes an aficionado. They become an apologist, and they can't help but love what they study.
You do see that, but particularly when there's money to be had. If you're studying China and if you're a China expert, if you want to get invited to the seminars, get the honorariums, the first class travel, 5-star hotels, well, you'd better not say anything the Chinese don't like. And there's also, as we know, in at least a self-selection in academia does tend to promote a certain person who actually sees the United States as bad. And they are enemies by definition, almost good. I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration.
No,
but
it isn't.
There are the exceptions. Say people like Arthur Waltron. There's June Dreyer at the University of Miami. Perry Link, a very principled professor who I think at University of California, Riverside, who for years, he's just said, I don't care if I can't go to China. I'm going to say what's true. But the number of those people, you could probably fit them into your studio right there. There's not a whole lot of them. But there are people, but the ones who have actually gotten up to sort of senior positions or prominent positions are relatively few. So it's that you do notice that, but take away the cash, and it'd be very different. I would submit. If it was say it was Nigeria, for example, is a really big place, but you don't find people falling over themselves to extol the virtues of the Nigerian system. But it's human nature on display in many respects, and how we've dealt with and handled the PRC, and the Chinese have understood. They've understood who they're dealing with, and they have appealed successfully to the things that will get us to do
our basis
what
instincts.
The
love of money is the fruit of all evil, says the scriptures. The love of money. And many people, and I do want to talk about Wall Street in a moment, and then we'll go into blood and gore and death and war. So WTO is pretty much 2000-ish, early 2000s. And I think that's when that testimony was for giving it permanent most favored nation status. So it is technically called something else. But you're saying that in the 80s and 90s, the United States government was encouraging offshoring by American corporations to China.
Yes, and it really took off. Once after 1990, and it didn't take much encouragement actually. Once the lemmings start moving, that they moved, and the idea was, well, you have to be in China. It's going to be fabulously wealthy if we're there. We're all going to get rich, but you have to be there. And you would ask, well, why? Well, because everyone else is. You had to be there. And you can see if you want to see the outcome of that, and it wasn't just the big companies that all went in. It was these little companies that moved their manufacturing to China. And that process started, say, if you use 1990 as a pretty good start date, but it just got really bad after 2000. But if you want to see the results of that, you go to any U.S. city of any size that used to have a plant or manufacturing, and you'll see these neighborhoods that you could see from the houses that these were people who had, decent lives, and they could raise families. They had communities, all the things that come of that. And they could send children to college. They could have a vacation. They just lived well. And that all was picked up, rooted out, and sent over to China. Too much of it was. So you go to these places and you can see the outcome. You look at these nice houses and then you look around, and it is a scary war zone. I would like to see it required of every staff member on Capitol Hill to actually spend a week up in Baltimore living in a cheap motel and being forced to be on the street from 8 o'clock in the morning till 11 at night, just to see the results of what we have done by this deindustrialization and moving our manufacturing over to China. And that has destroyed a generation or two of America, just completely destroyed it more effectively than anything else the Chinese could have done. And it sets these people up for drug addiction, drug abuse, most of which comes from
divorce,
comes from the PRC. The fentanyl, we hear a lot about that. Well, all of it comes from China. They could stop it in an afternoon. They don't want to, because you kill 70,000 Americans in a year and nobody does a thing. But that's the outcome of these economic matters. And the Chinese would call it economic warfare. And when you can convince the ruling class in your target country that they all have to be in China and that they move all their manufacturing, the jobs over there, and without a thought for the people that are going to be affected in America, you convince them to do that. Well, that has been a huge victory on the economic warfare front. And the Chinese consider economic warfare in the same way they do so-called kinetic warfare, the shooting war. In fact, the shooting war just comes last from the Chinese way of looking at things. So,
it makes sense. It's strategically.
So the war has actually already started. It started 30, 40 years ago. And the Chinese will tell you that. But we just choose not to listen because we're, of course, all going to get fabulously wealthy. But you can see the results of this war. As I said, you drive through, say, East Cleveland, Erie, Pennsylvania, Youngstown, Ohio, and you will see what our best and brightest have done to other Americans, to our citizens.
It's shocking to me.
The first person to actually say something about this to his credit was Donald Trump.
Donald J. Trump.
And that accounts for his success. Anyone else, it could have been said by any other candidate at any time. Nobody did. He was the first one to actually tap into this reality of the U.S. experience.
I was talking about the Overton window with my husband about a different subject, but related yesterday. And I said, we've really got to shift that window. President, and to be able to speak of this, I won't go. If I name it, then we'll go off that direction publicly. Because what happens in a nation or in a people is, well, at least in free Western societies, there are these subjects like you experienced in the military. We don't say it. Doesn't matter how true it is. We just don't say it. And the American people, I think, truly appreciate when a leader such as Donald J. Trump speaks about things that shock the left, of course, and shock, many Republicans. But what it does is, once you've said the unthinkable and you say it enough and enough and enough, then you have shifted the conversation and we can all speak about it openly and realistically. Because the problem is when you pretend it's not there, then it's never really real. You can't solve a problem you pretend is not there. And if you can't talk about it, there is no kind of a problem you can solve, right? So with the China thing, where do we need to shift that Overton window even more? President Trump did it in 2017. I don't remember it during the campaign that much, but that's just my memory. So he did the paradigm shift for us. Now, what is left to be done on that so that we're all speaking the same language, like a Steve Bannon? I'm not sure who else. Gordon Chang. I had him on some time ago. What would be the change in the conversation, bringing up things that are unthinkable? I wish I had pearls on that I could clutch as a metaphor, that people would clutch the pearl. Can't say that. You can't say that. Gordon Chang says we need to completely divest, decouple, cut, trade, and everything with China. And I said, wow, Gordon, talk about getting out there. What do you think is left to be spoken of publicly to the point where it becomes part of the national conversation?
Well, I think Gordon is correct. There really is no deal to be cut with the Chinese Communist Party. Maybe hope springs eternal, but it's generally springs eternal in somebody else's blood. But I think we need to get across this recognition that China is at war with us, that there is no accommodation to be made. And as I said, the Chinese view of war is very different than ours. We think it is, until the shooting starts, there's a chance that we can work out things. because the Americans like to talk, and they think if we just talk enough, we can work out all our differences. But we need to get to realize that these are people who are out to destroy us, and you actually use China's own word and to make that case. But the person who's got the microphone has to really convince the American public of that, and the evidence is there. And also, it's not just a shooting war. As I said, it's economic war, financial warfare, psychological warfare. Where you can get your entire business class, your elite, to think that they have to be in China. Well, that is warfare from the Chinese perspective. They would actually call it proxy warfare, which is using the elites in a given country to do your bidding for you.
So they're the forward troops in this war.
It's exactly what they are. That is what Wall Street and the
multinationals, the Wall Street giants.
There is no other way to look at that. And the Chinese will look at it that way. Useful idiots would be a charitable expression for that. And there's drug warfare, and that is one that this needs to be hammered home constantly. That we have lost well over 500,000 Americans in the last decade plus to fentanyl, all of which comes from China, and China could stop. If you don't believe it's an Orwellian surveillance state. Even Orwell wouldn't believe it. But here's my tip. Go to China and go out of your hotel, and you just take a Sharpie and draw a mustache on a picture of Xi Jinping. And let me know if the police are there at your hotel when you get back or 5 minutes later. They could stop it. But so that's over 500,000 dead. Most of these of military aid, people who could serve. And so from a Chinese perspective, you've taken 2 or 3 divisions of Marines or Army off the battlefield every year. And this is the dead. The ones who are facing
demoralization too. This is where families fall apart in despair.
And they call it entropic warfare, and you want to take apart, tear apart, dissolve something. Mm-hmm. And this is the target country, and you're weakening us. We're weakening us. They've been very successful about it. So a president and administration needs to make this point that China is at war with us, and fentanyl is the bellwether, because the Chinese have suffered no punishment from what they've done. None. Not even Trump won. And this is grounds enough to just say to the Chinese, look, we want nothing to do with you. And ultimately, the free nations are going to have to band together into both a defense bloc, but also a trading. And, you think you can kill us, and, maybe you could do it, look like you could get away with it, but the game's up. And there's no deal to be cut with a country that is killing us in these numbers. And then brazenly saying, well, it's your problem, America. It's not ours. In fact, that's what Xi Jinping basically told President Trump in the first administration. Said, you've got a drug problem, I don't. And you can see the effects, the power of the donor class on Capitol Hill, on our leaders who know what's going on, but they won't do anything. So this is something that you need to do, is realize the Chinese are at war with us, make that case, and then do what is necessary to defend ourselves.
Let's talk about specifics. Let's talk about, because I'm walking with you completely. I just did not, until I heard Gordon Chang say it the way he did it. He is not bashful. I thought, wow, I've never heard somebody actually just say sever all ties. I want to know what that looks like. What do you see the fallout from it? Because I'm always willing, I really truly mean this. Whatever the fallout is, Xi Jinping says we must eat bitterness, to his peeps, to the people, idiomatic phrase. But whatever, we have to make some sacrifices in the United States of America, then I'm willing to do that. And I think America should be. My mother grew up with, during World War II, they had victory gardens, and they used to collect cardboard and rubber, and they had not food stamps, whatever they called them, to get food.
Ration.
Thank you, ration. A little ration book. But I think President Trump right now is very, very aware that he's got to have economic success, and then we have the Wall Street class making all kinds of noise. And so I think he probably is in the mode of bobbing and weaving, doing something over here, letting up over here, but then planning on coming back. I hope that's what he's doing, because this new deal with China or the beginning of it doesn't sound very good to me. So it seems to me that we had pressure that China was ready to crack. Everything I've seen online from Chinese and people intimately involved with China, that their population collapse could be one of the biggest, best kept secrets in, I don't know, 100 years, that they are literally collapsing, that there is a real fear of unrest, that their economy is crashing, real estate banks are over leveraged, I guess. I'm not a finance person. I can't speak, that eloquently about it, but I can say that everybody seems to think that China's on the ropes. And then it looks like we're saying, okay, everything's all right. Pat you on the head. We've got a deal and let's move forward. Do you see that is what's happening, and what should we do, and what would be the consequences if we did what you're saying?
Mhm. Well, you do wonder if we're going to go for the jugular here. And it does resemble a wrestling match sometimes, where you got the other guys down for the 1, 2, and then he springs up. Well, we thought we had him down pinned. You saw that in the first Trump administration when they were going after companies like ZTE, the Chinese telecom company, and Huawei. They really had him, and then they backed off and let him off the mat. So I hope we're not doing it this time. I like to think the administration has learned its lesson. But at the same time, that we have built up such a dependency on the PRC that it's a vulnerability. And particularly when it comes to things like rare earth minerals that you need for much of our manufacturing, that we don't have it. And the Chinese are able to use that as leverage over us. So it's not going to be as easy as it ought to be. So, but at the same time, we do not have to do anything. We shouldn't do anything that helps the Chinese. One of the great, just awesome, which I would call it very impressive things, is the Chinese have pulled off their growth without having a convertible currency, which means that their currency is pretty much the equivalent of the scrip you would use at a high school fair. Now, you could use it to buy popcorn and caramel candy
At the fair.
Yeah, but take it
Only at the
outside,
fair.
you can't really use it. That's pretty much how the Chinese currency is. So they have got other people to fund it, which is us. And every year that when we buy all this basically cheap crap at Walmart, that we really ought to be writing a check of about $300-400 billion to the PRC in real money, saying, here, use this money to buy the Australian iron ore, to make steel, to make your Navy. And everything you need to pay for in real money, well, here's $400 billion spending. And that's what we've gotten ourselves into. So it's going to be tricky to wean ourselves off of this dependency, but there's no reason it can't be done.
But how? Give me like 2 steps. We'll start with 2 steps.
Okay. Well, the first thing you do is we've got all the rare earth minerals we need. Just the state of Montana alone could take care of a lot of it. Undo the regulations that make it impossible to actually exploit these things. However you have to do it, national emergency, whatever. But make it clear that we are going to look after ourselves, or we're going to get it from people who, are friends. But to do this, you've got to have some sort of sense of urgency, like we had in World War II, when guys like Henry Kaiser started the shipbuilding industry on steroids.
That's what I was thinking.
In Knutson as well. These guys, you need that sense of urgency, and we don't have it. And you're going to have to force Wall Street to you're going to have to force to start investing in the United States and to make it impossible to invest in China. The Trump administration's America First investment policy is excellent if it's carried out. And it does require, you can see how it is setting up the grounds for this sort of these two trading blocks. But you do have to make it impossible for Wall Street and the business class to invest in China. And that's one thing.
What is the mechanism to do that? Because as far as I can see, what we're constantly faced with as consumers of news or as, just American voters is, well, it's impossible to do this. You can never bring manufacturing back. Investors or Wall Street, major corporations, they're never going to leave China. You can't do that. My thinking has been, we tax it. If you tax American corporations, forget China. That's another story too. But then we just say, if you're going to offshore American jobs, because for me, much of this is about jobs and offshoring our wealth. And like you said, the middle class, but working class America, all of those cities and towns that are now devastated, they're like Mad Max terrains, or ghost towns. Why don't we just tax them? Instead of saying, bring something back and we'll give you a 15% corporate tax, what if we say, if you have one operation in China, if you employ any more than 1% of your entire company with foreigners, because, maybe there's one or two guys, you want on your gig, but if you employ more than 1% of your staffing is in China, then you will be taxed 35%, like it was not too many years ago before Trump. Instead, take it from 21 to 35%. Would that work? Politically, it would probably be impossible.
If there's a sense of urgency, people understand the threat. There's no reason Congress could not do this. And I think it will take punitive measures like to actually, and so you make it so the cost benefit is just it's too bad, too hard for the business class to actually do business in China. You can do it just on human rights grounds alone. The old South Africa was sanctioned, etc. There's any number of ways that you can, let's say, prohibit the investments into China from the United States, and you can actually extend that to our allies if you're clever enough about it. But you have got to stop funding this Ponzi scheme that is China. That will take some punitive measures. I'd like to see state attorney generals bringing lawsuits against major American corporations for really corporate malfeasance, for putting their shareholders' money, their company assets into a country where you cannot enforce a contract, where there's no property rights, where the host nation's intention is to suck your technology and then destroy you and replace you with a Chinese company. If the state of North Carolina had those conditions, nobody would invest, and there'd be shareholder lawsuits.
Why do you say North Carolina?
Just shows that I could be any 50 state. But the point is so obvious that why would you put your money into a country where their intention is to destroy your company? And you will never be any more successful for as long as they let you. And if this was in the United States, nobody would do it. But my point is that people tend to go insane at the prospect of selling one of something to every person in China. But this is where
how much wealth does the individual, there are buildings, entire cities that are empty, that are completely empty. They built cities and no one even lives there. What is this fantasy? Let me just ask this instead. Is the fantasy true that anyone is ever going to make millions or billions selling to Chinese? It's one thing to use cheap labor there and slave labor and prison labor to make cheap things and send them back to the United States. Okay, fine. You could make millions and billions there. But to sell to Chinese, is that really a market that's going to work for us?
Well, there's no empirical evidence of it at all. No, it's really not. But you would see the hype. It reminds one of an ad for a casino, where you see this photograph of these really beautiful people having the time of their lives at the craps table. And then the best picture, and that's it. And the better picture would be at the end of the night, or the end of the morning, where they're staggering out of the casino, having lost all their money.
Bloodshot eyes and rumpled and kind of, yeah.
That is the reality of the China market. And this has been no secret that the end result in China is never happy, and even Elon Musk is going to find that out eventually with Tesla. But your point is well taken, is that you don't make money doing business in China. But we need to actually apply the pressure on the U.S. companies that I said are funding this Ponzi scheme that is the Chinese market. And Congress can do this. Additionally, you've got to crack down on Chinese activities in the United States. And just a basic standard of reciprocity would work very well. If you can't do something in China, you can't do it in America. But you really have to scrutinize Chinese investment activities in the U.S. And that takes effort to do that and commitment. And I don't see that we've got it on the scale we need. But you have to realize that we are at a war with a system, and actually the people who are running a system which is out to destroy it. But do nothing that helps them, and stop funding the place and stop providing the technology that they need. And you may have to do it gradually. You can't just go cold turkey, given how our elite class has sold us out for all these years. But it can be done. I'm old enough to remember what it was like when all we bought from China was little cocktail, those umbrellas you'd put in a cocktail.
I remember that, and I'd look up at the bottom of the little items at the 5 and dime store. Ben Franklin, and everything was made in China and Taiwan too. There was a lot of Taiwan and Japan.
We used to have a pretty good country without doing business with China, and yet somehow we have gone insane and convinced ourselves that without China we will be living in skins and living in caves. That isn't the case. That we could do very, very well, and it's not as if everything is suddenly going.
Don't you agree, though? Instead of being temperate there, we wouldn't just do very, very well. Had we not offshored starting, let's say, 2000, I mean, we foolishly, we were doing it in the 90s, but had we stopped it then and not gone any further than the foolishness of the 90s, where would America's economy be today? We'd have at least 60,000 manufacturing factories in little towns and medium-sized towns all over the nation. 60,000, multiply that by the number of people that worked in all of those plants, all of those little cities, still being small town America. I've wondered before, why is it that in every movie you've got kids or young people in this little town and they're saying, I can't wait to get out of this town. And you look around the town in the movie, and then I realize, China, this is what offshoring our industrial base did. It gave us millions of kids that just want to get out of their hometown because it's a bordered up ghost town that was once a vibrant, charming, all-American city. And now that's where they eat the cats and the dogs. Just joking.
If you won't go up to Baltimore, go to Dundalk, and where the Sparrows Point Steel Factory used to be, and look at it now. And that's the payoff. But it's going to be no harder to decouple from China than it was to decouple American workers from their lives and from their jobs. It's just going to take a little. Somebody's got to want to do it.
If let's put together a plan. Mm-hmm. So I want to decouple. I want a pretty aggressive schedule, and if couldn't we go into a wartime footing? As you mentioned, when we started shipbuilding in World War II, it was incredible. They were turning out ships left and every few days. Couldn't we say we want ball bearings and magnets and rare earths, and say these are, and of course we're talking about chips. These are and pharmaceuticals. These are the various. I'm not going to add any more. But the various items that we need, steel, just add another one. And so we are going to give the tax incentive of a lifetime of, what can we lose? If they're building our ball bearings and magnets in China, how is that helping America financially, economically anyway? So if America said, okay, you build a ball bearing plant here, but make it in flyover America, and you build a magnet, here, and you build, we're going to give you 5% income tax for the next 30 years. I mean, corporate tax.
Well, and also don't forget cheap energy as well. For that short period, we had energy independence during the first Trump administration. That factors into this as well. I think that if we were serious about this, that probably within 5 years, you would see some real results. But being Americans, we'd probably do it even faster than that. But you would see it requires a psychological change as well in all of this. And I think so. I think you would see results very quickly. But 5 years, I think you'd see some pretty substantial concrete changes. But it is going to take a change in mindset. And so much of warfare is psychological. And we don't tend to realize that, but it can be done. But we've met, and this has been a communist Chinese victory, is to convince Americans that there's no alternative to how things are. But if you were alive back before 1990, you know that there is a real alternative to this, and just have some sense of, that there is an alternative to the Chinese communist system, period. But we can do this. We're Americans. I mentioned I worked for Motorola back in the late 90s. At the time, Motorola was one of the leading semiconductor manufacturers on the planet. It had huge operations in Scottsdale, Arizona, for example. And so when I hear now about trying to restart a semiconductor industry in Arizona with Taiwanese companies and maybe the Korean involved, you just sort of shake your head and say, well, we used to have.
Did we tell them to go to China? Is that what happened?
Well, what happened is the idea was that a lot of it went to Taiwan. But the idea was, in companies like Motorola, was that only loser companies manufacture stuff. What we're going to do is, we're the clever guys. We're going to design it and do the R&D, and we're going to get the lower orders overseas to manufacture.
We're going to be a service economy. We're going to be a service.
That was the thing. It was just the MBA class just screwing us over. And
they don't know anything. They're so stupid.
Well, if they were to go spend a week in Baltimore in a cheap motel, and they might learn something about America and what they've done. But it really was just the best and brightest who sort of puts us here. But it's nothing America cannot do again. We've been in bigger fixes than this, I think. But it's the mindset and the leadership. And this is, I must say that, you follow it long enough, and I don't care what party is behind it, but the first one to actually do something was that first Trump administration. And they're the first one to stand up to China and actually pay attention to flyover country. In my life, that I can remember, my adult lifetime, which goes back a ways now, and it can be done again. There's no reason it can't be. So I'm actually confident that if the will is there, it can be done. It is going to take some, as I say, some pressure on these companies.
Bannon, Steve's really, really been at the forefront on making China a national, part of the national conversation without embarrassment. China is an enemy, China's an enemy, and we need to bring down the CCP. I love that song. One of my favorite songs. So Steve's been great. Obviously, he was part of the Trump administration. We've got Gordon Chang. We've got you and others. We didn't get a chance to talk about the specifics of war. I wanted to talk about, Japan and the Philippines and Australia, that whole little ecosystem over there. And maybe you could come back and we could further the conversation. It's kind of an endless topic. The question I would say is this, that right now, I think we're in a unique place in history because President Trump has a certain amount of the American people understand that he's going to shake things up. They're not going to be surprised that he's shaking things up. And I think that he has a lot of goodwill banked or in his bank account from the American people. And I think a lot of people are against offshoring. They're against communism and our appeasement and all of this. So I think he can do these things. Who in the Trump administration, 1, 2, 3 people, who are the tough guys that really understand China, but really want to take it to the mattress and go to war economically and diplomatically or whatever other way? I know that nobody wants to go to kinetic war. Who are those people in the Trump administration?
It's a good question. Marco Rubio is good. I think Mike Waltz as well was very good on the Chinese communists and communism. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I know there are people, but at the top level, I think the Secretary of Treasury, Steve Bessent, is good. He's better than the last Secretary of Treasury, well, the last Trump administration, Steve Mnuchin, who was basically Wall Street's front man, who was China's front man. It was as though you had an internal civil war. So it's good to have a Secretary of Treasury who actually sees the Chinese as the threat that they are. And Mr. Trump himself, he does have a tendency to sort of get people sort of worked up if they listen to every single word he says. But I think he has a good understanding of the PRC, of the Chinese, and he knows what they did to him in his first term. And I don't think he's forgotten that. But that first Trump administration, you really had a good lineup of people who first time understood the PRC. But Marco Rubio's there, and he's got some good people on his staff.
How about Hegseth? Is he? Well, of course, we don't want to go to kinetic war. We want to prepare for war and not go there.
No, I think he's done a good job. And I think he understands the threat as well. I think he's done some things that have actually improved our prospects by simply getting rid of this DEI business in the military, at least trying to. I think he's fired some people who need fired. And he's made it clear that the military is about fighting a war. And he's got to have some good people. Is there any
Steve Bannon inside the administration right now? I mean, tough as nails, really, really tough as nails, let's do this thing kind of a personality.
I think Peter Navarro would probably be it. But there's only one Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
And I wish there were more. But he's great. Now he refers to himself as Mick, but he understands flyover America, and he worked for Wall Street. He worked for Goldman Sachs, so he knows how the racket worked, and that's one of the reasons they are terrified of him. But he's very good. I don't know that there is another one like him in the administration, but it could just be I don't know of that. And so. I think it's a pretty good lineup, but it's never perfect. It's a bit like assembling a fantasy football team. Everybody's got their opinion, but I think I'm reasonably confident, and they've only had about 6 months now to get things moving. But they, as I say, I think we understand, and we'll know more as these China negotiations continue. If we're going to let them off the mat, or if we're going to say, look, we gave you some time. We love you fellas, but...
We don't love them. We do not like anything about China. Yeah.
But we're going to stick it to you. I was speaking
it seems to
in a nice
me,
way, but...
I know you were. I'm playing with you. It seems to me that the only way forward, the only way with dignity and power and, not compromising our standing in the world is to play tough as nails and to say, we're monitoring fentanyl, and if we see any more, that's it. We shut this down, or we shut all of that down, and we literally draw a line in the sand. If we have any more fentanyl coming in as of 30 days from now, this is done, whatever it is. Number two, I would say the same thing with, there's so many things that they are doing, but like, for instance, with the GNC stores being owned by Communist China, and on 80 different stores on U.S. military bases. I mean, we've got to just make decisions and shut things down. We need to just say, you're out of these military bases. You're a communist Chinese company, and you're gone. Our national security requires it. And a state of emergency with regard to manufacturing. Is there a ball bearing plant in the United States of America? Even one?
I don't know. the fact that I have to think about it. I think you probably know the answer there. It's hard to overstate just how dependent we are on Chinese, but also foreign sources for that sort of material. Now, in terms of what we could do, you mentioned fentanyl. So I agree. I would say actually you got 30 minutes, and after that, then the top 10 Chinese banks are banned for 2 years from dealing in U.S. dollars, and we are going to approve every investment, every transfer of foreign exchange to China on a case-by-case basis. Going to take us as well 30 days to inspect every Chinese ship that comes into the United States. And we are going to expose the wealth, the obscene wealth of Xi Jinping and the top CCP leadership.
We've got that data, right? We know that he's got $1 billion or more in
we do. We could. We're spending $100 billion on the intelligence community. They should know. In 2012, the New York Times and Bloomberg actually did an excellent report on some of the wealth of some of the top Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping's family. In all these years, I have never seen the Chinese Communist Party bosses this furious, because this makes it personal. When the 600 million Chinese who live on $5 a day or less here, but they know how much their leaders have stolen, they will go berserk. And we can find this stuff, and you start putting liens on it, seize it, publicize it, and if they want it back, require them to sort of send us an approval notice from the Chinese government. That is the one thing that really scares. Marco Rubio actually pushed through a law requiring a report on them. And it came out about 2 months ago. And it was effectively the intelligence community, and unfortunately, the Department of State giving two middle fingers to the administration, to the American people. You saw this report. It's like 4 pages, and it got nothing in. And it was a year late. They had plenty of time to do it. They got the resources, and they should have been, and they didn't do it.
Is Rubio going to come out, or is he going to get cowed?
I don't know why he didn't. Maybe he's just got his hands full, but this is an area where you could really apply some pressure on these people, on the Chinese communist leadership, but we don't do it. And this needs to change. But say that, as I said,
can you write an article on the billions in Chinese communist leaders' families' hands?
I could, but you could also, if the government wanted, there's companies they could hire, and about an afternoon, they'd have all the information. Treasury should know all of this stuff. It's not hard. I used to do this kind of work, actually. And it's not hard at all. And when the first Rubio law came out a couple of years ago, the Chinese embassy in Washington were calling around frantically to their friends on Capitol Hill, saying, please, please don't do that. And that tells you something. But this is where they're vulnerable. So suspend those license, attorney general lawsuits for sure, for corporate malfeasance, go after the top wealth of the Chinese Communist Party, and don't leadership, and don't do anything that benefit. And you've got to wake up.
Good.
Well, you'd like to think.
Yes.
There was a young Marine major once. He sent me an email from Afghanistan, and he says, "Sir, sometimes I think we want to lose, but that's it. We've got a very good hand to play. We've got 3 or 4 aces if we would play it."
Well, you talk. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you were.
That's okay.
Sorry. I was just going to say, when you have a cover, of course, this is backwards the way it's appearing, but when China attacks, a warning to America by Colonel Grant Newsham, you're not afraid to put it all out there. You're tough. You call it like it is. But at the same time, what you're saying is, if we wised up, if the Trump administration does not get overtaken by Wall Street corporate giants, multinationals that only care about the bottom line, no matter what it costs America and Americans, that we could turn this thing around. And I think in only a few years, we'd be having factories just puffing out smoke out of smokestacks. I know nobody think that's a good thing, but that's all I could think of is. But so you're showing the dire threat that we face, but you're saying it's doable, and the Trump administration is perfectly capable of pulling it off.
Yeah, I think they are. And I, not saying that to be nice, but Warren Buffett said, you'll never go broke betting on the United States of America, something like that. I generally believe that, it requires a mental shift, that there's no reason that we cannot be what we used to be and look after ourselves and the other free nations as well. They've got to play their part as well, but it's not that hard to do. Just think of how many times we've been told that, such and such, we're finished. America's done. I remember the 60s, and I